this detachable spine is one of the coolest things I've ever made, and I made a pattern so that you can make one too. This character overall is called the Silent from a game called Slay the Spire, and I took some liberties with the design since it's pretty simple. So this isn't meant to look like a realistic human spine. It's kind of a mashup between the spine of a deer and the spine of a human, and I guess like extra tail parts. In my version, there are 7 cervical, 13 thoracic, 6 lumbar, and 5 sacral vertebrae. Anyway, I try to make this as like basic as possible and have the pattern itself create the curves so that you don't have to heat shape or sand it too much. Let me walk you through how I made this thing. Also, hi, I'm Hendo, let's craft. I'm using 4mm EVA foam from HD Foam. When transferring the pattern, make sure to indicate these red groove cut lines. You'll also want these tick marks. They're guidelines for the assembly. I recommend cutting out the grooves before cutting out all of the pieces just to cut down the amount of work you have to do. The solid ones are where a groove should be cut on the side that you're facing, and the dotted line is where there should be a groove cut on the opposite side. I have a bevel cutter, but you can use any knife to cut a groove as long as you don't cut all the way through the foam. I've talked about this technique in my Tannis Echo device video, and you can check that out if you need more help with this. You can see that when transferring the dotted line, if I actually made it dotted on the foam, that would obviously take way longer, so I'm just using 2 different colors. I'm doing all of the solid line groove cuts first, which is the darker purple color. Once all of these are done, I'm cutting off the top and bottom so that I can transfer those dotted lines, or in this case the light pink lines, to the underside. For me, this was easiest to accomplish by extending the lines down the sides of the foam, lining up the pattern piece on the back, and marking the lines again. Then I just use a marker and ruler to connect those markings. And of course, now these can get a groove cut. Once all the grooves are cut, you can cut out all of the pieces. I'm only kind of loosely cutting out the lumbar like arm things because it'll be cleaner to cut the ends after the 2 pieces are glued together. The lumbar vertebrae are the only ones that have a like top and bottom piece. Okay. Let's start with the thoracic vertebrae since there are 13 of them. We'll get lots of practice. Add contact cement into the grooves, wait a few minutes for it to become tacky. Then just close the grooves and it should start to take shape. We're also going to glue the sides down and this top part, but first we want to attach these little half moon sides. These are the same for almost all the vertebrae pieces, and this is how they're going to attach together onto strings. I added eyelets, but they're just glued in with super glue and not hammered in. They're just for a bit of reinforcement. I've double checked that the size will work, and now I'm gluing everything down for real. I found that doing 3 at a time worked pretty efficiently in terms of like waiting for the barge to get tacky. You can see that when the pieces are assembled, the writing is on the inside for these thoracic pieces. Now let's do the cervical vertebrae. They're pretty much the same as the thoracic ones, except the top part is a bit shorter and bends out at the top. These 7 pieces vary slightly in width, and the thinnest ones go at the top. Now let's do the lumbar vertebrae. The bottom piece is the shorter one, just glue down the grooves and the half moon side pieces. And this is the only piece where after assembly, the writing will be on the outside. The top piece is the longer one, and you just have to glue down the grooves to create this loopy knob bit at the top. Then glue the arms of the top and bottom pieces together, and also the top of the top piece. Finally is the sacral vertebrae, or sacral, I'm not sure how to say that. And honestly, these are made up, so tweak them as you please. I made this look like this because it tends to look more like a tail, which is how I see it in the art. But anyway, here's how it looks all together. I actually think it already looks pretty cool like this, but I am going to sand these pieces to take them to the next level. Here's what the lumbar piece looks like before and after sanding. I'm not going to bore you with like a ton of sanding footage. These are the main things that I did. 1, round out all of the edges of everything. 2, I took a grinding stone and smoothed everything out and created a little bit of dented texture. And finally, number 3, I used an engraving bit to make some like fine cracks. This is how the pieces look now. Some of this detail will be filled in by the Plasti-Dip and primer, but most of the texture is going to remain and should transfer and help make the painting process much easier. One last detail before we seal these pieces, I'm adding a half round foam dowel piece to the sides of the lumbar pieces. That's just to add a bit more dimension and mimic like this part of the IRL vertebrae. I think it adds detail, and I have a ton of these dowels, but it's definitely not like necessary. Okay, I sealed all of these with the Norwegian equivalent of Plasti-Dip, which is called Gummy Dip, and I had my first lesson in how freaking long it takes to try and seal and paint this stuff in cold and windy weather. Also, pro tip, skewers are nice for painting and sealing since these can run like right through the holes. Everything has a base layer of an ivory off-white color, so I should only have to weather these in order to finish them off. I'm going to do a dark wash first, which is just a very watered down acrylic paint, a mix of black and brown. I'm just wiping this watery mixture all over, especially making sure to get into the cracks and dents. I do 5 of these at a time so the mixture has a tiny bit of time to dry and mostly stain the ivory paint layer. Then I use a paper towel to wipe off the watery paint, and what's left is a stained bone look. And there's like darker residue in the cracks and stuff. I feel like it looks pretty good for how low effort the work is. Like, it takes time, but your brain doesn't have to like spin while you do it. I also dry brush some brownish black and only brush that onto the edges of the bones just to like bring out the dimension a little bit. It makes a very slight difference that I at least notice, so I like it. So all our vertebrae are ready to be strung together. I'm using a 0.5mm tiger tail wire, or sometimes just called tiger tail, which is a beading thread used for heavier beads, so it's really sturdy. But tiger tail wire can't be tied into a knot at the end. You have to use a crimp bead, and we'll get to that later. I thought the pattern on these beads was perfect since it looked like cracked bone, but since they're ceramic, they actually made the spine like 3 times heavier than it was without it because the foam weighs like almost nothing. So I did end up replacing these ceramic beads with little wooden spacers that are way lighter weight, but I did have to paint. Anyway, I strung all the beads and foam pieces to get an idea of how it looks. This is with the ceramic beads, but pretend I filmed replacing them. To finish off the end, the 2 wires will converge through the last few pieces. Then I'm going to crimp the wire and just glue this last piece onto the end wooden bead. To show you how to crimp tiger tail wire, I'm going to use an extra piece so that it's easier to see. You'll need a crimp bead, a wire guardian, and bead crimping pliers. First, feed in the crimp bead, which is basically just this tiny tube. Then loop the wire into the wire guardian, through one leg, around the channel, and through the other leg. Then feed the wire through the crimp bead again. This piece is basically just extra insurance to keep the loop from slipping back through the bead. And now we get to crimp. Place the crimp bead with the 2 wire sides into the kidney-shaped hole of the crimp pliers. Then just squeeze it down. It should have this crimp now with a wire through each side. Then place this in the rounder hole of the pliers and squeeze. This should fold the crimped bead in half. Sometimes this actually ends up like opening the crimp bead again, but just go slow so you can see and make sure it's actually folding. You can stop here, or you can add a crimp bead cover if you want, and that's just this C-shaped metal thing that you squeeze to make round and cover the crimp bead. It's like 50-50 whether I manage to make this line up, so do with that information what you will. So here's that same process, but with 2 tiger tail wires converging together as one. You can cut off the excess wire past the crimp bead, but I think it's like a little bit safer to loop it back through a couple more beads and pieces and then cut off the excess. Now some super glue on the final spine piece to attach it to the wooden bead. I also glued beads to the open ends of these bottom pieces to make stringing easier. It wasn't worth making like an itty-bitty piece of foam to make the sides of those pieces. Also, sorry I didn't film it, but the wires converged through this 3rd sacral piece. So now obviously tighten up the spine pieces, and then we're going to crimp the top ends. And this is the same process as before, except that I've also looped a lobster clasp into the wire guardian. So crimp bead, wire guardian, and lobster clasp, back through the crimp bead, crimp it, fold it down, add a crimp bead cover if you want. Then I again feed it back through a few of the beads before cutting off the excess. Now the spine is essentially done, and you can attach it to whatever you want. For my silent mask, I got 2 triangle D-rings for hanging picture frames. I use super thin wire to puncture a hole in the mask and then like loop it around a tiny washer on the other side. I basically use this tiny wire as like sewing and sew it to the mask, then reinforce that whole mess with clear super glue. Since the spine is quite lightweight, it can hang onto these 2 points pretty easily. And ta-da! That's how it looks fastened on, and now I can bask in what I've made. I can probably use this for several projects. Maybe I'll do something spooky for Halloween next year. It was a lot of work, but at least you only have to make it once. You can also seal these pieces with a clear varnish, but it's too cold to spray paint outside now, so we're just doing it raw. And that's it for the spine tutorial. This is how it turned out. You can get this pattern on my website, which I finally made. Yay! Check it out if you have a chance, and you can also check out my Patreon if you want to support me in the videos I make here. Next year, I'm going to start doing more like topical commentary or video essay type stuff, so I'm really excited about that. But I'll always be making tutorials here too. Anyway, thanks for watching and stay crafty! Thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon, especially my top tier patrons, Ricky Rod 33, Mike D, Andrew Leo, Grant Valentine, Robert Reyes, Turner, Nips86, Nicole, Josh M, Shot and Wolf, and Adam Trubiano. Thanks!